Okay, good evening. Um, it's always slightly weird to speak to yourself in your living room, so I'll just have to feel that you're there. And yeah, thanks, Noe, for inviting me to speak about resilience. And the aim today for me is really to give you sort of thinking tools for perhaps the sessions that are coming afterwards. So today is more going to be like the framework for, and a couple of maybe tools for thinking about resilience and change. Um, yeah, so as Nori already said, resilience is a buzzword. A lot of people talk about resilience today. If I've sort of did a small overview of what you can find on the internet when you type in resilience, and one aspect is really this personal resilience. It's very kind of individualized perspective around recovering from burnout, recovering from capitalism, and things like that. So you're stronger than you think, and other stuff, which comes from psychology. And then another way that resilience has been used a lot is in the development world, where things like sustainable development have been sort of used interchangeably with the word resilience in a way for disaster recovery, disaster resilience. So it's can be a little bit cynical when you look at it that way, but it can also be interesting to see that it's not about developing the undeveloped, but more about uh, giving resilience to very fragile societies that have been weakened by colonialism. So you could argue that. Then you've probably heard about urban resilience. So how do cities get resilient? There's basically a resilience index about with different criteria for making cities more resilient. This is from the Post-Carbon Institute, which you might know. It's quite aligned with the transition movement, and it has its own branding, and it's around resilience, inspiration for turbulent times. And that's sort of the type of the definition of resilience, I guess, that in the transition movement people are using quite a lot, because all these kind of mean different things. So we have to really be careful what we use as words, to not use just buzzwords that don't mean anything anymore. And then, yeah, if you go to Transition Network these days, which is the Transition Network is the sort of international network that's still based in Britain, but it has inputs now from all around the world. And if you go to their website, you can see some things about resilience, but they also speak a lot about reimagination and rebuilding. So that's interesting that they use these three words, and that resilience can also be completed by other concepts. And then also, like last week, I got this in my mailbox that the permaculture movement is now also using resilience as a more, as designing for resilience is something that people will more readily understand maybe than other words. And then you also have, in a different type of way, it's being used as in resilient organizations. So how do we make leadership resilient and effective? And that's sort of a very different way of using it, again, a bit more related to the psychological part. And then I found this as well, which is basically people that use resilience to, as they say, unlock value and drive sustainable performance. So it's much more, let's say, in line with current economic paradigms than perhaps other ways of thinking about resilience. So that's just really a small overview of resilience for you, what you can find out there. A couple of weeks ago, I put this on Facebook, and it's most of you will know it. It's the kind of grief curve that Kübler-Ross's work was sort of based on. What happens when we incur a loss, and sort of in times of change. And I found it interesting that these people had just changed it into the change curve. And so I put it up, and then this person kind of said to me, yeah, well, this curve is only relevant if you have the virus. And I was like, really? Okay. I was kind of surprised at that. And so I was kind of interested in their response, you know, that they say, okay, well, if I don't have the virus, the change is not going to happen for me, which, you know, maybe after 2 weeks is looking kind of very different. So resilience is really about how we think about change and how we relate to change and how we prepare for it. And in a way, that's something very old that people have always been faced with. It's just a philosophical question of, you know, things are always changing and nothing's ever the same and so forth. But in how far can you change things and they still, you know, resemble themselves, you know? And that's sort of where I think resilience is an interesting concept and a systemic concept there, where we can learn something. So this is an overview of where resilience is kind of used, in which areas. And basically the kind of resilience that I will be talking about is putting together the notions from ecological systems. And then also, yeah, bringing that together with sort of social appreciations of that from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which are sort of looking a lot at ecological systems and social systems and how they interact. And that's sort of an interesting perspective to me. And we're not going to talk about all this stuff down here about resilience in material science. I don't know anything about it. The social sciences have been a little bit more hesitant about and critical of the idea of resilience in a way. And we can go into that later if you like, but it's just a side note that it has been taken up quite a lot in the sort of, you know, the more sciencey, the more hard science studies like geography, environmental studies, and ecology, and less so in the social sciences. So that tells us also something about this notion and where it comes from. So yeah, so life is sort of self-organizing systems that interact with their environment. If you have this is a very abstract thing, but the loop with the little arrow is basically a living being, and it has interactions with the environment. It's just represented that way. It's not very important why it's represented that way. And we're basically self-organizing systems in the sense that we just go and go and go until we don't. Yeah, and we have interactions with the outside all the time through our respiratory processes, our digestive processes, and so forth. And so the resilience is really looking at how much can you change without becoming a new person. Yeah, and how much can, for instance, a city or a forest change without becoming a new city or a new forest? You know, how much can we change it before it sort of changes its property? Is this a linear process? Is this something that goes differently, that is evolving in a non-linear way? Yeah, so this is really what resilience is focusing on. And maybe you know this definition of resilience, it's the capacity to bounce back from outside disturbances. Yeah, it's basically to go back to a state. If you've been sort of messed with, you kind of strong enough to go back, you know. So maybe you in this personal resilience thing, you survive trauma, you go back to who you were, or, you know, just things like you have an illness and you go back to your normal way of being. And the interesting thing, also, I think this sentence also got me thinking quite a lot now in the situation of coronavirus, that resilience gets maintained by probing the boundaries of resilience. So if you're just staying inside all the time, you don't get very resilient in a way, you know. So resilience is also about checking out the boundaries. Yeah, it's a little bit like when kids grow up and they try to see what are the boundaries here that I have of like normal and accepted behavior. So these are two really key issues that relate to resilience thinking. And if you have a system that I sort of represent like this, yeah, it's sort of at an equilibrium down here, and it has a certain latitude. Yeah, that's sort of where it can move without changing. It's sort of a nature state. There's a certain resistance, you know, how steep these walls are, for instance, or how resistant it is to change. And then another thing that Brian Walker always talks about is then the feedback effects. You know, how precarious can it go from its state of equilibrium? You know, if we kind of mess with the forest, then in how far can we bring it to the edge, you know, until it sort of is not a forest anymore, you know. So yeah, this is a paradoxical thing, you know. In order to have resilience in a forest, you kind of need to play with the fire, really, or with other really disturbing factors. But on the other hand, also, if you change it too much, you will perhaps go to a threshold, and it might go to a different system altogether. You cannot recover the other system, basically. So you've had the threshold. And then here it just says Panarchy. If you're really interested in like deepening this, then go and look it up. It's sort of all the outside and different levels of interactions that a system has. And this is sort of how in the 70s and 80s, basically the ecological science has sort of qualified systems. There was an equilibrium state, and then, you know, you can move it a certain amount from there. But if you move it too much, it might go to another state. Yeah, it's a little bit like, yeah, if you have a fever, you know, people can take only so much fever. If you go beyond 41, you know, you might go over the threshold, type of thing. So this is basically how resilience is thought about in ecology. This is actually, and I'm going to stop the graphs in a moment. If you kind of get the sick of graphs from this period, maybe we've looked at a lot of graphs. So this is from an economic context, but it's sort of taken from ecology in a way, to kind of say that there is a certain window of viability between efficiency and resilience that is sort of viable. Yeah. If you have too much efficiency, then the system becomes quite brittle. We don't have enough diversity. And you see this today maybe in soil systems that have been monoculture crops for a very long time, and so forth. If you have too much resilience in a way, you know, then it becomes quite stagnant in a way. So so if you do your permaculture wrong in a way, in your garden, you don't do much and you don't really manage the stuff, then you might go on the other side of the curve and it might not be viable at all, because then it's, you know, maybe not being productive for you. But that's a very human-centered perspective, as you might agree. Yeah, so this is another thing to think about resilience. So what we said before is that, you know, once it goes over the threshold, the ecosystem will shift. And here, this notion that you all know probably is the planetary boundaries, and that is also from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, where in 2009 Johan Rockström first modeled this, that actually the change isn't linear, and the change is sort of after a certain amount of change, you go into a different type of system, and so you cannot recover the original system in a way. And they defined 9 boundaries, 4 of which are really critical. And yeah, and some of these are more important than others, but 4 of them also have been crossed in terms of the boundaries that are the planetary boundaries, and that basically shouldn't have been crossed. Yeah, that's the sort of biosphere integrity, so the biodiversity loss, then the biogeochemical flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, and land system change related to agriculture, and also climate change. Yeah, so basically these are the things where we, and you might have seen this, I think it was last year that this study came out about hothouse Earth, you know, where runaway climate change would sort of really change the system of Earth, and that we wouldn't be able to stabilize it anymore because it's gone off to over this threshold. Yeah, so, and this is when we think about resilience, it's like, how do we deal with these systems that are already degraded or not so much degraded, depends on what system we're talking about, and how far are they recoverable and adaptable to new circumstances. So you probably heard about this term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And this is the current state that we're in now. It's basically a lot of different feedback loops that are happening. And people have been writing about those, that there's a sort of state shift. And if you're here and if you're interested in transitioning to sustainable Luxembourg or sustainable wealth, then you probably heard of all of these. And I think of these as sort of expressions of a VUCA world in a way, and a very strong desire to find resilience in this VUCA world, you know. And you know, these guys and Extinction Rebellion, they kind of, for me, these are expressions of a VUCA world that is kind of going into a very different direction. And what do we do about this? These are all focusing on the ecological losses that we are incurring at the moment due to climate change. And then we also have things that talk a lot about the economy and how that's sort of driving very unsustainable state shifts in a way, where many more people are driven into that, many more people are driven into poverty, this sort of thing. And then we have people who talk about collapse in a way. That's just another way to talk about what is going on and how this state shift perhaps is happening. And then, my main question is for the moment to see how we can have more resilience in such a context. And I found this, and I was like, you know, it sort of intrigued me, so I put it in. Basically, it goes, so normal, there's other people who try to adapt it somehow and improve. So the reformist, all this sort of efforts. And there's more visionary people who are always said, these, you know, dreamers, we can't think about this, it's not possible, visionary adaptation. And then it's also this discussion that's always going on, you know, we sort of have to go through crisis for change to happen in a way. And so if there's a system shock and there's a crisis because of, you know, lack of adaptation or preparation to the crisis, then here in this diagram, you see that resilience is going back to normal, which is like, okay, that's interesting. And then there's also a transformation to the unthinkable, which is also interesting. And I suggest that maybe this is also a kind of resilience if you think about the resilience in a more transformative way than perhaps just going back to this, you know, absorbing the shock of the change and going back to what you were before. So for me, this resilience concept in that sense is very interesting to think about. Then I wanted to give you these 7 principles that are also coming from the Stockholm's Resilience Institute to think about systems and how they can be made more resilient. These sound quite general, and they sound also a little bit like permaculture principles, if you're familiar with those sort of inspirations from nature and how nature does things. So basically, one is to maintain diversity and redundancy in your system. That is not everything is centralized here, and redundancy, you know, perhaps with agri-crops or with respirators, you know, this sort of thing. The principle 2 would be managing connectivity. And also, you know, when I look at those now, you know, I see a lot, and maybe this is shared to explore later. I see a lot of these things that, you know, have also made coronavirus what it is today. And it's really about this connectivity, this extreme connectivity that we've been so good at in a way. But we haven't done it quite cleverly in a way. And the third principle is really about slow variables and feedbacks. And really, this is like the core of systems thinking, to see what the feedbacks are in a system and see what slow variables we can bring. And how we can play with those. I'm not going to talk too much about these things. They're straightforward enough to think about them also in the abstract. And then the fourth principle is fostering complex adaptive systems thinking. And it's like big words there, but basically it's about how do we as organisms adapt to things? What is our adaptability? And also, how can we think in these terms? How can we think in systems thinking? How can we think like nature, basically? Principle 5 is maybe surprising but encouraging learning in systems. Often we do the same mistakes over and over and over. I'm just talking for myself. But yeah, encouraging learning in systems and sharing that. And a lot about that is, I think, about collaboration and about making mistakes together and really documenting those mistakes, and also yeah, letting people know about that. But it's also then about trust. Do I trust this person to to help me develop this thing, to fight something or other. And then based on that, again, is broadening participation, and to kind of really bringing in different perspectives and different sectors, different types of ways of seeing things, different practitioners together in an effective way, not just for show, really like broadening participation and collaboration. And finally, it's another big word, I'm sorry, promoting polycentric governance. It means that, yeah, governance, so who can have different roles and who can have authority and equivalence in circles, is not just based on one person, but on very different persons. It's again, that as we're learning the hard way at the moment, that various people that are economically having not been valued in our society are actually the essential workers, key workers. So yeah, so for me these, and they work for all different contexts. Yeah, whether you want to think about economics, whether you want to think about I don't know, circular economy, whether you want to think about agriculture. These are principles that can be applied and that have been applied in various collaborative research. Because yeah, I haven't said this before, the Stockholm Resilience Center is also very good at bringing together socio-technical systems with ecological systems, and really also in the research bring different practitioners together. So, and final thing, perhaps we can really talk about different dimensions of resilience on various different levels, and how we can relate to that in terms of our personal resilience. How do I keep the anxiety down so that I can sleep at night and that I'm sort of half decent person during the day. How in our community can we really reach out to people, and maybe they are not the people who we think they need help, but yeah, and reaching out also to ask for help and to request for help, and also to see how we want to go on in a way. And then that also links to the state environment, to institutional environments, and that links to the perception of power and how that sort of works in our environment, basically. Yeah. So these are the different dimensions that we can think about when we think about resilience and systems, and how we can influence them, shape them to withhold the sort of challenges that are getting in our way. Perhaps this year still, maybe in 5 years, maybe ongoing. How can we rise up to this? Yeah, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say. So thanks, and I hope it was useful, and I'll speak to you soon.